First, we add our opening and closing script tag. First, we want to get the date using the built-in date function. Create a variable called date and set it equal to a new date function. We can use console.log to check to see what the result is. Go over to the browser and right-click and choose Inspect or Inspect Element. Then click the console to see what it says. It will show you the current date. When we click the arrow to expand it, we see that there are other functions we can use to get specific information such as the month, day of the week, day of the month, and the current year. For the month, the computer starts counting at 0, so 0 would mean January and 4 would mean May. For the day of the week, 0 would mean Sunday and 3 would mean Wednesday, and so on. You can always Google this when you work with dates in JavaScript to make sure your code is doing what you think it is. This built-in date API is useful for finding out what day the week starts on or making a countdown or accurate calendar. Next, you can create a list of months so that we can display the actual month May as the title. Instead of showing the number 4, we'll get the 4th index from this list. Technically, the 0 index is the first element in the list, which is January. The first index would be the second element in the list, which is February. So in this case, we can get the 4th index, which is the 5th item in the list, which is currently May. Now that we understand this relationship, we can write the next 2 lines of code that will update the title to say May. We create a reference to the h1 element with an ID called title. Then we save the reference as a variable called title. Then we want to replace the HTML in that h1 element. We can get the month from our list of months array above. We can use the number stored in the current month variable from before, or in this case, the 4th index, and print out whatever is in the 4th index of the list, which is the word May. So now our screen will show May instead of month. The inner HTML changes from the word month to the word May. The current month variable has the number 4. Counting from 0 to 4, we get the word May. To update the name of the habit, we must get a reference to the HTML element. We can get the reference using the ID name, which is called habit title. Then we can save the reference in a variable called habit title. Then we create an onClick function to tell the computer what to do when the element is clicked. We want to show an alert or prompt. The question of the prompt will be what's your habit? We want our input space to show whatever title is already there in the inner HTML, which is my new habit by default. The user can either leave it as is, erase the words, or replace the words. If the user erases the words and leaves it blank and presses enter, the variable will be blank and have no text. So the length of that saved text would technically be 0. But we can't leave the habit title blank, so instead we will set the habits variable to the phrase click to add your habit if the length is 0, or the space is left empty. If not, we can set the text or inner HTML to whatever they typed that was saved in the habits variable. If the user makes no changes and just presses enter, the same words will be saved to a temporary habits variable. Then we will show whatever text the variable habits has, so the same words will be shown in that case. This is how your web app should work for those 3 scenarios. Once the habit title is clicked, the user will either replace the text or change the text, but it will never leave the title blank. The next thing to do is create a list that has the number of days in each month so that we can easily update the total days number for any given month. Then we can use the current month index again, which is 4, to get the current number of days in the current month from the list and have an accurate number of days on our chart. So in this case, the 4th index, which is the 5th element in the list, is 31, so we will store the number 31 to update the calendar in the next part. For simplicity, our code doesn't factor in leap years, but you can challenge yourself to add that feature later if you'd like. We also need to store the number of days completed in a variable, which will be 0 to start. Finally, we will create a reference variable to the total days text so we can update with the numbers we just saved. To set up the calendar, we need to loop through and stop at every day on the calendar and set the ID to the corresponding day. For example, the first circle or day div should have an ID called day 1. Then we can use the ID to set up our click function to update the calendar later on. For each day, we have to either set the background to pink if the habit is complete or leave it white if the habit is not completed. We will also add a border around the current day div. Since we split the days of the calendars into rows and columns, we need to use 2 for loops to search through each row and then stop at each column using the days and day classes as our references. First, create a counter variable called day count to keep track of what day we are on. I like to start at 0 since the computer starts at 0, and my loops start at 0 too. Then we'll need a row counter variable called row count to keep track of which row of days we are currently looping through. Next we get a reference to each row, which is just every div with a class called days. Then we save the reference in a variable called days. Now create a for loop that starts at 0 and stops at the number of rows of days, which is 5 in this case. This is equal to the length of the list stored in our days variable. Each index or element in the list refers to a different row. The 0 index or first element is just the first row and so on. Now we have to go through that row using our row count variable to tell us which row or list to look at. Then we create another variable called day to temporarily hold a reference to each column in that row or list. The first time we do this outer loop, we would grab every div in that first row by looking for the class called day. Then we add another for loop to loop through the total number of columns from our day variable, which is the length of the day list, which is 7 for each day of the week. Then we can start adding our background colors and borders. Since our day count variable starts at 0 instead of 1, but a calendar starts at 1, the day count will always be off by 1. So if the current date is the 6th and the day count is at 5, or 6 minus 1, that is when we should add a border to show it is currently that day. Here is where the day count variable is very useful. Right now, every day div has a pink background color. If the month has 31 days, our calendar should start at 1 and only go up to 31. So let's add an if statement to set the background color to white, set the correct day number, add the correct corresponding ID, and leave all the spaces after that blank. It is currently June, so this calendar should only go up to 30, and the rest of the circles should disappear after that. So starting from 1 until 30, we should set the ID number to the matching day. Else, we should set the background color of the circle to white and remove the text to make it appear empty. So we pretty much loop through each row, check if the day is less than 30, and update the number, then go on to the next day until it's time to check the next row by increasing the row count. Once the day count is 30, we just set all the other circle divs to white. To erase the black borders, we simply scroll up to the style for the day class and remove the line that sets the border to black. For the final 3 sections, I'll show the entire block of code and explain what each line of code does, so you can type it out and follow along more easily. So here's what we have so far. We used the built-in date API to figure out the current month, date, day and year and printed it to the console log. The log shows 5, and we add 1 and get 6, which means it's currently June. The weekday is 3, which means it's Wednesday. The date is the 28th and the year is 2023. We created an array of months so that we can easily and dynamically update the title to be the corresponding month. Since the current month is 5, we can check the 5th index, which is the 6th item, which has the word June. Next we make a reference to the HTML tag that shows the title and set the inner HTML to what is in the current month index. In this case, it's the 5th index of the months array, or 6th item, which is June. Then we reference the habit name or habit title and make a click function. If they leave it blank, we set the habit title to say click to add your habit. We will ask the user what's your habit, and autofill the answer with whatever text was there before. If the user actually writes something, we'll use whatever they wrote, which is now saved in the temporary habits variable. Next, we created an array containing how many days are in each month. Then, since we know the current month index is 5, we grab the 6th element from the days in the month list. In this case it's 30. We update the total days to show that. Finally, we set up the calendar days. Our calendar has 5 rows and 7 columns. But there are only 30 days in June. We need to update the numbers from 1 to 30 and leave spaces 31 to 35 blank. We use a nested for loop to search through the calendar. We use a day count variable and a row count variable to keep track of which row and column we are currently at any given moment. Each row has a class name called days. We create the outer for loop with variable I, starting at 0, to get a reference to the first row. Then we create the inner loop to stop at each of those 7 days, each of which have the class called day. The first if statement checks if it is stopped at the current day and adds a border if the current date is the same as the current day count of the loop. The next if statement is used to update the numbers we see on the calendar as well as the ID. Because our day count variable starts at 0, we have to add 1. So now the first day we stop at will have display 1 and have an ID called day 1. We keep increasing the day count after every inner loop. Once we get to the 7th day, the row is complete and we go to the next row by increasing the row count by 1 and we repeat the loop to continue counting the days. Once we get to 30 or however many days, we remove any text or background to make it appear empty and we don't set any ID. The day spaces for day 32 to 35 are technically still there, but they are invisible and not functional. At this point, we have less than 100 lines of code left to write. Next, we need to create a way to store whether or not the habit is completed for that day. First, we create an array called completed with a maximum of 31 spaces to represent 31 possible days. Then we create a for loop from 0 to 30 or however many days are in that month. We need to store the month, date and year, and then store true or false if it's completed or not completed. By default, the habit is not completed or false. To store this information, we will use local storage in the browser. Local storage items have a key and a value. This is how you save and update items in local storage. The key is hello, and the value is now 1234. And this is how you delete all key value pairs. For this project, the key will be a string containing the date, and the value will either be true or false. To check if a key with the date exists, we create a temporary string that has the month, date, and year and use this as our key, and then we check local storage using the key and the local storage getItem function. The first time this website is opened, or at the beginning of every month, the temp day variable would return undefined because no keys with the new month exist yet. So for the first time that this code runs, its main purpose is to initialize all the dates of that month into storage where the key would be the date and the value would be false by default. Every time the code runs after that, its purpose is to check whether each day says true or false. This is so that we can count how many times we see true and update the total days completed fraction. Every time we reload the web page, it will run this code and the habit counter will update. When we reload the page, local storage should look like this. The first time the page is loaded or if a new month begins, local storage will not have any items from that month. It will either be empty or only have dates from the previous months. After the code has been run at least once, local storage should now have items for the dates in that month. After that, the values should either say true or false, depending on if the user has updated it. After this, we need to check the storage again and actually use that information to make the calendar accurate. We can simply get the item from local storage using the date and change the background color of the day. Change it to pink if it's true, meaning that the habit is completed, or change it to white if it's false. First, create a temporary string that holds the date. Use the local storage getItem function to store the value retrieved using the date. Create a reference to the HTML for the current day in the loop. Check if that value retrieved is strictly equal to true using 3 equal signs and set it to pink if so. If not, it will be set to white. Repeat for every date and the calendar is now updated. The dates are still showing pink because we forgot to remove one line of code from our CSS. We want to make sure our day class is white, not pink, by default. So let's remove this line of code. The last thing we need to do is set an onClick listener for each day. So when we click any day, it will update accordingly. The conditions are that the date must have already happened or it must currently be that date. If the habit is not yet completed, clicking it should update the background color to pink, set the local storage value to true, and increase the total days counter +1. If the habit is completed, clicking it should set the background color back to white, set the local storage value to false, and decrease the counter. If all the days that have passed have been completed, we'll add an alert that says great progress. Our calendar is made up of a bunch of divs and they all have the same class called day. So we can create a list of references to all of those divs with the same class name by using the query selector function. We can see that the day divs variable has all of those days. We see instead of writing out individual code to add a click function for each day, we'll write a for loop to set the click function dynamically. But we don't want to be able to click every day. We only want to be able to click the days that have already passed or the current date. So our for loop will only go up to the current date. Let's create an onClick function for each day div. E represents the event that happens and it gives us some useful information when we print E to the console log. The E, or the event, in this case, is a click event. We can find the target and then find the inner text or inner HTML. This will give us the day number, which we can save into the number variable. We create a selected date variable and use it to store the date easily by using event target ID. This is so that we can reference each given day to change the background color. Again, we create a string with the date and use that as the key. We use the local storage getItem function to see whether the value we get back is true or false. If it's false, then we should switch it to true by updating the background color to pink and updating the local storage to true. And also increase the days complete +1. If it's true, we do the opposite and switch it to false by updating the background color to white and setting local storage to false and decreasing the days completed by 1. We can then reset the total days completed habit with the new days completed number. And we can add our own progress conditions. I'm going to add an alert that says great progress if it's 100%. And there is a typo here, it should say else if, not just else. And lastly, we can add a reset button. This is essentially a loop that stops at every day of the month and sets all the days back to white, sets local storage values back to false, and sets the total days complete back to 0. And here is the final code, 300 lines total. Thanks for watching and let me know if you want to see any more coding tutorials. Leave an emoji in the comments if you made it this far. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll try to help.